It's wonderful to connect with all of you through the virtual medium. And thanks again, colleagues, for making it possible. Although I couldn't travel to Seoul to meet all of you, which would have been lovely. It's indeed a great pleasure joining all of you today. As Patrick mentioned, I have a simple task as a part of this great session. You have fantastic speakers and country presentations. Before that, my task is to give a broader pitch from my perspective and what our team sees it as on to answer the simple question: are treasuries really agile? Were they agile during COVID-19? To what extent they did well, and what are the areas where they could have possibly done better? So that's my broader scheme of what I'm going to talk about. How am I going to do that? I'm going to answer the simple question of whether treasuries were agile enough or not by using two sources of information. One, from a historic perspective, the PEFA assessment reports, and second, from a practitioner perspective, what we kept hearing and seeing from various countries, not very empirically on a research mode, but more from a broader understanding perspective. So those are the two sources in which I would be pitching my talk today. So let me request Rufio to also enable me share screen, and I'll bring my slides up. But before I start off with that, as I start sharing screen, let me just pose a question. Is there anything called treasury being an agile treasury, or should treasuries by nature be always agile? Is there a universal definition of anything called agile treasuries? Please think over while I work on this sharing of screen, which is coming up just in a moment up there. Okay, I think we got it here. I guess now you can see my screen. So in terms of my broader pitch, so there's no universal definition of what is an agile treasury, but there are some characteristics which probably in crisis situation we can call as treasuries were agile. For example, are they responsive? Are they flexible enough? Did they do efficient disbursements, payments, and management of cash? Did the controls which Treasury had support value for money? How did we deal with risks of fraud and corruption? And were they able to continuously learn and make progress? So this is the broad definitional characteristics one can look around. For example, I started my career as a civil servant. I was an accountant general of a large state back in India, from where I come from, before I moved into my international career. So properly, I would say that some of these characters would be relevant practically almost in any country, and that's where we are pitching. So we used a kind of a quick note in April 2020 to put together what could be an agile treasury, the way a treasury could be agile during COVID-19, and that's what I'm going to talk about, how treasuries have done over time. Before I do that, let me pose a kind of a quick thought about PEFA. For those of you who are not aware of PEFA, Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability, it's known as a gold standard PFM assessment framework used globally in 155 countries. So now, including many from East Asia. So what PEFA does? PEFA measures PFM performance. It doesn't assess the policies of government. It's just a diagnostic tool. Now, if you put all the PEFA scores, and PEFA scores each country or each parameter on a scale of A to D, the A being the highest and D being below the basic level of performance, think for a moment, if we are bringing all these countries' PEFA scores, PFM scores, and adding together, what would be the global score? Will it be an A, B, C, or D? Probably some of you thought it's A, some B. Since I'm not there, I cannot see you specifically mentioning. But the answer is it's a C. That's what PFM systems at the beginning of COVID-19 were globally. An average score, and averages never give a kind of a great answer, but still it's a some indicator. What is that indicator? This is an indicator that PFM systems were definitely okay, but not good enough. There is huge scope for improvement when countries went into the crisis. Now, if we take the broader public financial management system, in that Treasury becomes the core. Treasury activities are the core. So if the broader PFM systems are just okay and not great during the time of crisis, Treasuries naturally are likely to face typical challenges. Now, let me cite 3 examples of the kind of global broader PFM systems influencing a Treasury thinking. For example, 2/3 of all the countries globally, they struggle in maintaining a reasonable level of budget credibility. Means budget declared and actual always vary. Some part of it could be because of Treasury, but many is out of control of Treasuries. So in that environment, governments went into COVID-19 and Treasuries had to deliver. Second, if you take a global example on fiscal transparency, half of the countries have quite a bit of money spent outside the government financial statements. Now, if financial statements are not capturing, if we go behind that, it means probably various treasury systems in some countries may not be covering that. So to that extent, it's a kind of a fundamental risk with which one is going. So in terms of like significant, when I say half countries keeping money outside, it means a significant amount of money. More than 10% of expenditure, if it is outside the financial statements, then it's treated as a significant amount based on the definition that I am using. Then let's take even procurement. For example, 63% of all countries, based on the statistics, these are all statistics based, have more than 40% of their public procurements done through single source environment. This is not all being done from treasury level. This is done at a decentralized level, at spending agency level. So it's in this broader backdrop that countries, treasuries had all of a sudden to face this COVID-19 crisis and still deliver flexibly in an agile fashion. All these statistics are from the global report on public financial management issued by the PEFA Secretariat. At your convenience, please do take a look. Now, if we have gone like this, how did countries do? What's the general take about countries' performance? Quite surprisingly, and actually to be very happy about, is despite significant weaknesses in broader PFM systems, the global trend we see is treasuries didn't become the bottleneck in government's ability to deliver COVID-19 response. So the summary of it is treasuries did well. Treasuries on various things. There are still areas which they could have done better. What did they do really solid? The whole focus on cash management. Cash management typically is treated as one of the weak areas globally in pre-COVID era. COVID-19 time, there is conscious effort right from probably the president or prime minister, the finance minister, in managing cash better. So generally within certain limitations, countries seem to have managed cash pretty well. Constraints of cash, more spending. So they had to focus and they did pretty well. Some jurisdictions also did well in kind of taking a tired approach. For example, prioritizing some payments and delaying some payments consciously, even if they are due, to manage the cash effectively. This is something which we saw in some countries, which was very interesting. The best thing that happened that one notices, obviously many of you would have experienced, is the level of virtual activity treasuries were able to do. So the quickly going to home-based work and working around so that the government operations are not stopped. There are very few cases where significant problems are affected the government, but treasuries generally seem to have done well in moving in a virtual world, making use of the IFMIS system, treasury single account, banking automation, all these things together enabled treasuries well in reacting in an agile way. Use of emergency provisions. This is an interesting area. So we saw that in some countries, whichever country had pre-established emergency provisions as a part of treasury rules or financial regulations, they all actually had an advantage in terms of ability to deliver on COVID-19. They quickly triggered and went ahead that, and some of them even did very well to do a sunset, means once the emergency is over, go back to the original practices. So that's, some countries did well. Some others who did not have emergency provisions even went ahead and created emergency provisions exclusively for COVID-19, and they had also fair success. And to that extent, emergency provisions, documentation, and codifying, or at least issuing instructions, is taken as an important area, a lesson from COVID-19. Tracking of COVID-19 expenditure is something very mixed in my opinion. So what we noticed is most of treasuries, governments generally were able to track cash, track expenditure against a programs or spending agencies. But the question which many people keep asking is, governments come out and make this nice statement saying we are going to spend this percentage of GDP into COVID expenditure, or this package is announced. Now, were treasuries really able to track and establish how much it is spent? That's where there is a difficulty because of also definitional issue. So what constitutes COVID-19 expenditure is anybody's guess in many cases. So there are like some increase in expenditure. Can we treat it as because of COVID-19 or not? These practices made it very difficult to identify exactly in a country how much is COVID-19 expenditure. Different countries had different practices. So some of you may recollect that the G20 donors, IMF and World Bank also supported that, institutionalized a debt service suspension initiative where countries who borrowed money need not pay the interest and installment during COVID-19 pandemic period. Now, we were asked a question to assess how well this additional fiscal space created because of this the relaxation on debt service really went to COVID-19. When we looked at numbers, very few countries we were able to really get that kind of an information. The broader narrative was that general expenditure is high, so probably the money has really been very well spent on COVID-19. So this is something for future, is an area, how to track. There were some good practices, but still this is something which one can further work upon. Now, let me take you through a couple of other thoughts. Is accountability and audit trail lost? So there are countries where internal audit or external audit even started real-time audit and went ahead quickly. There are other places where they slowed down a little bit, given the space to government to more focus on emergency. So there were many innovations. The audit trail the loss of audit trail, if in some cases, one would say that audit trail may have been a little affected, particularly when traditional PFM controls are completely overlooked without formal processes. So whenever it is overlooked, to go into a kind of a more out of an ad hoc decision without even documentation and not through emergency provisions, there was little question of audit trail, and this is an area which is going to come back. Right now, auditors general, supreme audit institutions, many countries are reviewing the COVID-19 expenditures. So all this is a learning experience into going into future as to in a crisis how to ensure audit trail is very strong. If I can recollect, at the beginning of pandemic, the IMF managing director then said, so please spend, but keep receipts. So now the question is how well the receipts and beyond receipts maintenance, the trial is maintained is something which is an interesting thing to learn from as we completely move out of the pandemic. There are other things which worked well, war rooms, crisis management systems, which were in many countries institutionalized in the Treasury. They were very agile, did very well. Technology was leveraged a lot, as I already mentioned. Now, are they preparing for the next crisis? Few places we see very conscious efforts by the Ministry of Finance, by the Treasury to prepare for next crisis. Few other places we see Auditor General or agencies like that preparing reports for enabling government to prepare for next crisis. But definitely this is an area which probably one can focus further, because whatever is done, there is definitely much more scope for improvement. Let me quickly touch upon one aspect which changed a lot in PFM world before COVID and now. So pre-COVID, PFM systems are treasury job. Basically treasury's mechanism of establishing the financial management system. Now, in many countries, pre-COVID also there were demands, but that really gone up in terms of health sector's role, particularly service sector's role. There is increasing demand from service sectors for quite some time on more flexible and adaptable PFM systems and treasury practices. And that became like now with COVID, we see in many countries, health ministry and finance ministry have become closer partners in aligning the PFM systems to put things together in a programmatic approach in some cases, minimizing the line item rigidities in some cases. So there are, these are also like some good practices which we saw particularly from with the focus on health, which came during the COVID-19 as such. Of course, there are some challenges like special funds. Some special funds kept completely outside the accountability cycle and even the PFM cycle. Probably those were risks which need to be mitigated wherever it's done, and better practices evolved for future. The questions of like, again, like health sector lost a lot of money in the process of COVID-19 simply because health sector was implementing a lot of money for example, vaccination in many countries and other reasons, and that was being considered as health sector. So now this distinction on PFM systems enabling whether really the sector has got its due in terms of money is an area to think through in forward. So in general, I would say that the health sector generally has come closer to the Ministry of Finance. We will find post-COVID world more and more service sectors demanding from PFM systems for more flexible and adaptable practices to everybody's success. So it should work for Ministry of Finance, the Treasury, and it should work for the sector ministries. That demand is going to go up from what we see. With that, let me now quickly jump into after COVID. Where are we? Are we really now, if treasuries were able to reasonably manage COVID-19, is there room for complacency? Actually, it's not. Even this latest statistics today on very important processes relating to treasuries. For example, consolidation of cash balances, you can see the score is just a little over 2.5 out of 4 on a global scale. Cash forecasting, slightly better, 3+, but surely could have been even better. Commitment ceiling information, this has been a killer in many cases, even pre-COVID, and during COVID, that became even more complex. How well commitments are defined and communicated to spending agencies to maintain over a period of time. This is an area for further work in the post-COVID world. Even now, things are not really looking up very bright on commitments on a global scale. In-year adjustments are significant, which means budgets are keeping on changing quite a bit, which may be for many reasons. During COVID-19, it's even more acceptable because if I recollect well, 71 or 73% of governments had huge expenditure during COVID-19. So practically that would mean that in-year adjustments would happen, but in post-COVID world, it should again come down to a kind of a reasonable level. How are we going to achieve that would be a question. Expenditure arrears is a typical area I would like to mention. So globally, like most of us know that public debt is important and we focus on public debt management and the ballooning debt in countries. What is not often focused is the arrears. In some countries, even the ability of Treasury to get to know how much of arrears is weak, particularly if transactions are done out of the IFMIS system, doesn't happen in all the countries. Some countries do it perfect, some countries don't. So not doing it through the Treasury, through the IFMIS system, and then you don't even like typically Treasury, the head of Treasury or the Minister of Finance doesn't even know an expenditure arrears in some countries. We notice that eventually the expenditure arrears are calculated by internal auditors going desk to desk to some spending agencies, ask them, have you issued contracts outside system, take those numbers, adding up, vetting it, and then getting to this number. So this has been weak expenditure controls and stock of expenditure areas. This has been a serious area of concern in many countries, which possibly will need to be fixed in the post-COVID world, because any crisis, all these areas become even more complex because payments would stop. General control environment, if I say that the general control environment is reasonably okay, which is also like right now, there are little bit areas to improve. With that, let me make a concluding comment on this. So Agile Treasury operations gave us several lessons to learn. So on the positive side, if I take these three buckets, on the positive side, business continuity was ensured. Reasonable, very good innovations on internal coordination and communication within Treasury and spending agencies were established. They're all very good practices. Now, the determination of legal provisions of emergency arrangements for core Treasury functions and also the emergency rules to be triggered. Variety of practices globally, and that's an area one needs to be focused to make sure that almost every country would have a default system to their own default system to go when an emergency strikes, and business continuity from a process perspective is ensured. The last would be the post-pandemic environment management. This learning, the perception now, some countries are doing very well, but there are many, one would assume that they are falling back to a kind of a very complacent and a happy scenario that now COVID is off nearly from our day-to-day life, though still the virus is around. The crisis is not as big as it was in the past. So the learning part of it, the seriousness with which issues were being looked at in the past, it's not consistently seen in all the countries. So this is an area probably we all should work together. This is a learning process. We in the PEFA Secretariat and in the World Bank, we are working on this with the intention of sharing few thoughts, learning from you. For me, I'll be very glad to connect with each of you in person or virtually, bilaterally, to interact and learn from you and share thoughts as well. With that, let me stop here and welcome you to visit our PEFA website and follow our social media channel. Whenever you are in DC, please do visit us in PEFA. You can always drop me an email. We'll be glad to receive you, and I'll be happy to take questions from here. Thank you very much. Over to Patrick.